My name's Joe Bennett. I'm from the University of Birmingham, and I'm here really just to introduce Owen Jones, who'll be talking today. Welcome to Birmingham, Owen, and welcome to Waterstones, all of you. Owen's here mostly because of his book, Chavs, the demonization of the working class, which came out last year, as you may well know. It was very well received, having some the historian Eric Hobsbawm called it a passionate and well-documented denunciation of the upper class contempt for the proles that has recently become so visible in the British class system. And for me, I think that really says it all. And we may also have come across Owen on the radio and television, doing such things as debating the riots with David Starkey and the Communist Manifesto with Jeremy Vine. These were some of and I think what's really important is in Owen's book and in all these media appearances, in his television appearances and in his radio appearances, he said something that has, for some reason, been very controversial, but which we all know, which is that social class is an important feature of our contemporary society. It's very strange that this has been so controversial, I think, but it has. And it's social class not as something about individual ability or individual tastes or preferences, but as a social, economic fact. And it says something about the poor state of political discussion in our country that this has been so controversial, and that Owen is, to some extent, a controversial figure. But it's good to see Owen making these contributions. And so, without any more introduction, Owen, I'll hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Nice one, cheers for that, and it's great to be in Birmingham. It always raises an eyebrow when I start talking because people wonder who the 12-year-old is. Wonders at the front is. In fact, she opened the door the other day and the guy asked me, "So is your mum in?" You're surprised how often that happens. Whenever I go on telly as well, people always tweet, "Who's Owen Jones and why is he doing his paper round?" etc. Because they always think they're the first one as well. Anyway, just in terms of the book, the whole point of the book, to be honest with you, was in however limited or modest a way to try and get a debate going about class. But to be honest with you, I found I was kind of pushing at an open door. Because I think if the book had come out 4 years ago, I don't think it would have made half the impact. And I think that's for a variety of reasons. I think firstly it's to do with an very protracted economic crisis that we're very much in the middle of, which is affecting people in very different ways, depending on where they are in the pecking order, if you like. So, for example, the Sunday Times Rich List came out this year, and that looks at the top 1,000 richest people in Britain, and their wealth surged. And in fact, last year it went up by nearly a fifth. And the year before that, it went up by 30%, which is the biggest jump that had ever been recorded. Take boardroom pay for the top 100 companies. That went up last year by 49%, and the year before that, it went up by 55%. And if you just compare it to everybody else, the average Briton is now going through the biggest squeeze in living standards since my grandma was born in the early 1920s. And in fact, it's projected that in 2016, the average Briton will be worse off than they were at the turn of the century. So I suppose this idea, this almost became a cliche, didn't it, by the government, we're all in this together, which I'd argue has veered between the ludicrous and the offensive ever since the Rose Garden and David Cameron and Nick Clegg sealed the coalition. But that, in a sense, was why I think this myth, which I wanted to challenge, everyone's now middle class, I think that's why it got swept away. Also helps, I suppose, in the worst possible way, having a Tory government. 22 out of 29 members of the cabinet are millionaires, and of course, they're introducing policies which are having a very detrimental impact on people from very different backgrounds than their own. And I think, again, that contradiction, if you like, I think that's focused people's attention, if you like, on class. I mean, there's been interesting other developments too, which is like Occupy, for example. And the slogan of the Occupy movement globally was, "We're the 99%." against the 1%. It was this idea of the vast majority having different and indeed conflicting interests with the people at the top. It's an attempt, if you like, to resuscitate a form of an idea of class for the modern age. But most specifically, as I said, I wanted to challenge this idea, which was very common during the boom period, that we're all middle class now, and there was one exception to that, which was this idea that the old working class had disappeared. If it was aspirational, it had become middle class, leaving behind a feckless rump, which I suppose the term Chavs, in a sense, just best summed up. So, for example, Simon Heffer, I don't know if people are familiar with Simon Heffer. He's a right-wing journalist. He was at the Daily Telegraph, before that the Mail, and he said what sociologists used to call what was once known as the respectable working class no longer exists. What sociologists used to call the working class no longer works at all, but is dependent on the welfare state. And I suppose that sums up, if you like, that caricature. Even though he made it clear he never used the term chav, in fact his kids who go to Eton apparently use it all the time and he's livid about it. But that sums up that myth. And for the right, the idea was we're all middle class apart from what was known as the underclass. So Charles Murray, who's a political so-called scientist in the United States, who's most famous for a book called The Bell Curve, which argued that black people had a lower IQ than white people. But he argued that this underclass was created by people's own behaviour, specifically people in lower socioeconomic groups having lots of children out of wedlock. It was this idea of a behavioural cause. For New Labour, it was a bit more nuanced than that. They again, Tony Blair repeatedly said we're all middle class now, but the exception was what they called the socially excluded. Now, I interviewed Matthew Taylor, who was Blair's former head of strategy, and he said the difference between social exclusion and class is that class is assigned to you, whilst social exclusion is something which you have a role in creating. You have a role in your own exclusion. And he said it wasn't just about blaming the poor, but he said it was partly that too. So that was kind of the myth I wanted to challenge. But what was interesting, and there was a study which annoyingly came out after the book was published, which looked at widespread attitudes to class. And despite this very widespread myth, I'd argue, that we're all middle class now, actually people were quite stubborn of self-identifying as working class, even through the boom period, about 50 to 55%. But this one study by Britain Thinks actually showed that in that particular study, 71% said they were middle class and just 24% self-identified as working class. Now, what was interesting but also disturbing about it, Deborah Mattinson, a pollster who ran the survey, she said that the working class tag amongst people calling themselves middle class had become a class-based slur like chav. And when she got people to go away and get clippings from magazines, play word association with what they thought working class meant, people came back with things like teenage pregnancy, antisocial behaviour, spending money in a tacky way, plastic surgery gone wrong, which I just didn't understand at all, to be honest with you. But the idea, why people call themselves middle class, was it just seemed classy. Now, amongst working class self-identifiers, people were asked again, what does it mean to be working class to you? And the most common response that came back wasn't a sense of pride, but it just meant being poor. Now, what was interesting is how people look at class in a cultural way. So, when people wanted to come up with a symbol, what does it mean to be middle class? And in the end they settled on a cafetiere. Can't believe it, that. But that was this idea, it was a cultural thing, if you like. It wasn't economic in that same sense. And for me, these findings, in a sense, were depressing, but they weren't surprising. In a society where positive representations of being working class have all been airbrushed out of existence, where people told and effectively aspirations about becoming middle class, and even that everybody is middle class in the first place. Now, there was a study which I looked at, an example, if you like, which I think fleshed out that idea. And that was a case comparing two missing girls. Now, the first one I'm sure everyone's familiar with, it was Madeleine McCann. And she went missing back in 2007. It was almost a bit of a national trauma. Not to say it wasn't obviously a huge tragedy for those involved. But within 2 weeks, £2.5 million was raised. TV anchors went out to the Algarve and reported as though it was a national crisis that was unfolding. And there was a bit of soul searching by journalists. After all, I mean, it was a tragedy, of course, but there's not a shortage of tragedies in the world. Why the focus on this one young girl? So India Knight, a journalist at the time, she said that these holiday resorts catered for the middle classes. You could go there and look around and feel reassured that these were people just like you. She said it wasn't full of the sorts of people who slap their kids in supermarkets. Now, when another girl went missing, Shannon Matthews, a few months later, and at first it seemed quite similar, another young girl tragically disappearing. But the difference was, firstly, this was in a very different community, and the background of those involved was very different. It was Dewsbury Moor in West Yorkshire. It used to be a textile area, really battered by the destruction of industry. And there was far less coverage, in fact less than a third of the same amount of coverage. Just £25,000 was raised over the same period. So again, journalists did a bit of soul searching. Why aren't we as interested in this young girl who's just gone missing in tragic circumstances? And one said, he was being completely candid about it, he said it's grim up north, it's full of not very appealing council estates and abandoned wasteland, and it's full of the sorts of people capable of fulfilling the worst stereotypes of the white underclass. Another journalist said the white working class of Dewsbury Moor are like a foreign country, and compared it to reporting from Afghanistan. But actually, in reality, it was a very different example of a very different case, because what had actually happened is Karen Matthews, the mother of Shannon, had kidnapped her own daughter to extort money from the tabloid press, which I'm sure we'd all agree is a pretty damn abhorrent thing to do. But rather than seeing it as one act by one individual, it was used to say this is the tip of the iceberg. So the entire community, and I had the privilege of speaking to people involved in that campaign who put everything into it. Most of them happened to be in work, as a matter of fact, very low paid work generally speaking. They put huge amounts of time in, they created leaflets in different languages, they went all over the shop, they'd been lied to like everyone else. They were attacked in the press as a shameless style community, as in the TV show Shameless. The community was compared to war-torn Beirut in the 1980s because someone went to the shop apparently in a dressing gown. I don't know if people are familiar with the Lebanese Civil War, but that was the least of their troubles, if I'm going to be honest. Anyway, but that it became with Karen Matthews, again it was seen as a tip of the iceberg. So another journalist, Carol Malone, said, I used to live near a council estate. It was full of people like Karen Matthews, as though council estates are full of people kidnapping their kids to extort money from the tabloid press. Another, Ian Duncan Smith, who is now the custodian of our welfare state, he said it was like a door had opened into another Britain. And his think tank, the interestingly titled Centre for Social Justice, they then linked what had happened to their proposals to reward council tenants for good behaviour, which is normally an expression reserved for animals, pets and children, and prisoners, by giving them a stake, part ownership of their social housing. It was an explicit attempt to link an absolute outrageous act by one individual to the 10 million people in this country living in social housing who found the whole case as abhorrent as everybody else. Another journalist, Melanie MacDonald, said the old working class across the country has declined into an underclass. It is a decline that this unfortunate woman, Karen Matthews, embodies. So this case study I thought was interesting because it did sum up, it fleshed out that idea that basically everyone's middle class and all that's left are this problematic rump. Now, I think the thing which most interested the media, particularly in the book, was about popular culture, and I looked at that, the change in portrayal. And I'd argue there's been a massive shift in the course of a generation. Without getting a bit rose-tinted about post-war Britain, it's easy for a 27-year-old to do that. But in the aftermath of World War II, I interviewed, for example, a number of directors, people like Ken Loach and Stephen Frears, who began to come into prominence in the 1960s and wove class into all their work. And they said to me it was impossible to ignore working class Britain. This was in the aftermath of the first post-war Labour government, a very strong trade union movement, and all the rest of it. So, for example, you had Coronation Street, which was very different when it started than it is today in 1960. It didn't have the same sensationalist plots, larger-than-life characters. It did, in some way, look at a working-class community as it was in Manchester, and within a few weeks it got 20 million viewers. You had a whole wave of films, Northern Realism, which looked, again, at class and tried in some way to look at the realities of class in Britain. You had a whole range of shows, like The Good Life, for example, which offer middle-class people on the receiving end of jokes, The Likely Lads. The Rag Trade, which was a sitcom about female trade unionists who took on their bosses and won. It's unthinkable you'd have a show like that on TV today. You had Only Fools and Horses, and interesting that one, because Del Boy's a bit of a clown in lots of ways, but it wasn't a sneering representation. You were laughing with him, not at him. And then, for example, Alvida saying pet. And I think there's been a change in that, reflecting what's happened in politics and broader attitudes. The reality of working class Britain's been almost airbrushed out off our screens in favour of often very positive representations of middle class people on one end and then grotesque caricatures on the other. And I suppose Vicky Pollard's the one that always comes to people's minds, and Matt Lucas just wishes he'd just stop going on about it. And to be honest with you, the beef isn't with him at all with that creation. I mean, as a matter of fact, when people are laughing at it, it is the creation of a privately educated multi-millionaire male comedian dressing up as a single mum on a estate who's so thick she swaps one of the kids for a Westlife CD. And you do often sound like a sort of whinging, sandal-wearing Guardianista who just can't have a bit of a laugh to mention it, but I'll just give you an example of how it's used. So there was a poll done of people working in British TV a few years ago, and over 70% of them said that Vicky Pollard was an accurate representation of the white working class. So it's the way these caricatures are used. I'll give you another example, actually. I had the pleasure of debating a journalist called James Delingpole. Has anyone come across him before? He's a one-man walking political broadcast for the Labour Party in all the wrong ways. He argued, I had to debate him because he argued the last discriminated against group in Britain were white, privately educated, middle-class men like him. Apart from the fact they run pretty much the entire country, I thought he had a point. But he talked about Vicky Pollard. He said, the Vicky Pollards of our world have got it coming to them. If they weren't quite so repellent, we wouldn't need to make jokes about them, would we? The reason she caught the public imagination is that she embodies with such fearful accuracy several of the great scourges of contemporary Britain. Aggressive all-female gangs of embittered hormonal drunken teenagers. Gym-slipped mums who choose to get pregnant as a career option. Pasty-faced, lard-gutted slappers who'll drop their knickers in the blink of an eye. Dismal, ineducable, he goes on, to be honest. But that, if you like, is the way a caricature like Vicky Pollard, again, got passed off in some way as reality. Now, sometimes, actually, it's interesting with journalists, it's sometimes a bit more blatant than that. There's another journalist, also at the Telegraph Factory, Janet Daly, and she spoke of a time when her cars clipped another car and the guy got out and started ranting, and she said it was the classic example of an English working class psychopath. And she said she used it to launch into this tirade arguing that the working class in Britain was the remaining detritus of the Industrial Revolution, which had no civic culture of its own. Another example she talked about, she was talking about going on holiday, and she said because of the advent of cheap flights, you couldn't escape the louts. And she said what was worrying about it is the people who were going abroad who were louts weren't poor people, she said. They were people who once would have been described as having respectable working class jobs. For her, what she regarded as nice and polite middle class people, who use their columns to slag lots of people off, but for nice, polite middle class people like her, their holidays were being ruined by uncouth, rude, antisocial working class people. And it is actually something which a holiday company has actually tapped into, called Activities Abroad. What they do is they offer very expensive holidays, and they actually went through their database and looked at the names of the sorts of people going on their holidays, and they found lots of people called Alice, Joseph and Charles, but they said it was a Brittany, Chantal and Dazza-free zone. So they said they could legitimately argue they were offering Chav-free activity holidays. Now, they got a bit of stick, to be fair. So they came back and said, I simply feel it's time the middle classes stood up for themselves, regardless of whether it's class warfare or not. So, if you like, that kind of contempt is quite widespread and quite accepted. And what I was interested in why that came about, and I'll level with you, it might not surprise a lot of the audience, but Thatcherism doesn't come off that well. But the argument I'd put is, from 1979 onwards, a class war was fought in this country, and it ended with a resounding defeat for many of the pillars of working class Britain. Now that can be oversimplifying. I'll give you an example. Over half of workers were unionised in 1979. It's just over a quarter now. Of course, that's not to say everyone was... there were a large section of other working class people who weren't. But what those trade unions were in many communities was a sense of identity and pride, a sense of empowerment. Now, throughout the 1980s, they were absolutely crushed. That was, for example, because of anti-union laws, the most restrictive now in Western Europe, as Tony Blair once boasted. It was because of a number of defeats the trade unions suffered, not least the miners' strike. And it was often seen the miners were the most powerful section of the labour movement, and if they could be defeated, then anybody could be defeated. But also mass unemployment, because if you've got 4 million people out of a job, people think that makes people really likely to go out and want to go on strike. It doesn't. Most people just want to keep their jobs. And often if you've got 4 million people unemployed, you've got at least 4 million others who are terrified of losing their own jobs. So all of these things battered the trade union movement. And in fact, it was interesting because Sir Alan Budd, he led the Office for Budget Responsibility under this government, he used to advise Margaret Thatcher. And he said in the early 90s in an interview, his worry was that the policies that he was asking to introduce, supposedly to reduce inflation, he worried that actually it wasn't about that at all, but he said was a very good way of increasing unemployment, which he said was a very good way of reducing the power of the working classes, as he put it. So that's something which even advisors to the Thatcher government openly speculated about. But of course the other aspects, the very rapid deindustrialisation, the attack, the destruction of industry in this country, in the early 80s it was the most rapid of any Western European country. Now again, it's not to glorify a lot of these jobs, they were often dirty, back-breaking jobs that excluded women. But again, often entire communities were built around mines or docks, for example, factories of various description. They disappeared so quickly and left a vacuum which was never actually replaced and remains often having not been replaced even to this very day. And what also you got at the same time, as well as this idea of aspiration being wanting to move out of the middle classes, and the working class become middle class. In fact, I should just quickly point out the other point was right to buy. Now, because of the failure to replace the stock sold off through right to buy, council housing sold off during the 1980s. Council housing increasingly became prioritised for those most in need. It's a massive change from the 40s when Nye Bevan, who founded our health service, he said the vision of council housing was to create mixed communities. He said where the butcher and the doctor live next door to each other. And to a degree that was achieved in the late 70s. It's a shocking statistic that a fifth of the top 10% of the population lived in social housing of various description. So you did have those mixed communities, but they were very quickly fragmented and became increasingly ghettoised, and that's a process that this government is accelerating. But as well as all that, what Thatcherism really tried to hammer away at was what we once regarded as social problems, like poverty and unemployment, weren't social problems at all, but the products of individual faults. So Thatcher was not one to mince words, to be fair to her. In the late 70s, just before she came to power, she said there is no such thing as primary poverty anymore in this country. Okay, there are people who don't know how to budget and don't know how to spend their earnings, but she said you were then left with a basic personality behavioural defect. That, in lots of ways, was at the very heart of Thatcherism. That if you were poor, that was your own fault. Another classic example is Norman Tebbit, one of the right-hand men, and as unemployment was soaring in Thatcher's Britain, he said back in the Great Depression his dad went out and looked for work on his bike, and that became then turned into a national cliche, get on your bike. And it's this idea again, even if there's mass unemployment, it's your own individual responsibility to sort it out, and if you don't, then that's your own individual failing. And that's why that's had a huge impact on people's attitudes, I'd argue, today. So the Social Attitude Survey, which comes out each year looking at people, their attitudes to poverty and employment, that actually showed that even as poverty and unemployment increase in the current crisis, there's still a growing sense that people are poor or unemployed because it's their own responsibility. So it had a real impact on attitudes. Now, the other thing I want to do in the book was to look at what I think the reality of class, which has just been airbrushed out of existence. When we talk about working, if I talk about the working class, many people would argue, well, you know, that is a bygone era. The industries that supported it has disappeared, so what's left? And it's true, in 1979, over 7 million people worked in manufacturing. Today it's just about 2.5 million, it's still going down. So I'd argue what's happened is you've had this shift from an industrial working class to a service sector working class. The shift from the dock, the factory, the mine, to the supermarket, the call centre, and the office. So if I go back to Stockport, for example, the people I grew up with often are working in call centres or in supermarkets of various description. There's as many people working in call centres now as work down the mines at the peak of the mining industry. It's as good a symbol for working class Britain as any. Retail, supermarkets and so on, that's now the second biggest employer in the country. And there's some benefits actually compared to industry. It's cleaner, it's less backbreaking, it doesn't exclude women as much, although women are disproportionately focused in the lowest paid and most insecure work. But these jobs, well, firstly, you don't have communities built around call centres and supermarkets. The jobs are often far more transient. There's a huge increase now in temporary workers, over 1.5 million, who don't have the same rights as other people. People forced to do part-time work because they can't get full-time work. That's over 1.3 million and going massively up in this crisis. So at the same time, it's become far more insecure. The work's often far less well paid. So I went to Birmingham, just down the road to Longbridge, and spoke to people there who obviously 6,000 of them lost their jobs just a few years ago. Now, of those now working in supermarkets and the service sector, which is the biggest chunk, they're on an average of 60% of what they were once being paid when they worked in the factory. So it's a huge shift in that sense as well. And the other point, of course, is unions are very, very weak in the service sector, almost non-existent. So you've got this far more hire and fire, fragmented working class. You don't have communities built around them in the same way. And also in those areas most badly affected, for example, I went to Ashington, used to be the biggest pit village in the world. Since that pit closed in 1986, that community has not recovered. So I met ex-miners who'd been out of work since the pit closed back in the 1980s. I met a young lad who did a 6-hour round trip to Scotland to work in a factory because he couldn't get work there. I met someone else whose kid ended up joining the army just because he couldn't get any work. So communities like that, where you've got massive levels of high permanent unemployment, because they never recovered, and they're often, of course, described as kind of full of work-shy or workless people who just don't want to get on their bike, if you like, and get work. Now, what I wanted to just to finish this bit, because the most important bit is the discussion, not me rambling on, to be honest, but it all comes down to me, to voice and to representation. My argument is that work, if you like, power in society has massively shifted to those at the top, away from the working majority, if you like. So, if you take Parliament, just to talk about actually the background of MPs, over 2/3 of MPs now come from a professional middle-class background. The number of anyone from a working-class background in Parliament declines at every election. In fact, less than 1 in 20 MPs come from any unskilled background whatsoever. Often politicians increasingly have never had a job outside Westminster. If you look at the media, and just to go back to that example, one journalist calling Dewsbury like a foreign country, well, it is for many journalists. Because of the top 100 journalists, over half are privately educated, according to the Sutton Trust, and just over 1 in 10 were educated in any comprehensive school whatsoever. How will you get an accurate representation of society around us in that situation? But for me, the point is, because the point isn't about pity or anything like that, it's about organising and it's about power. And I think recently we've seen, I think, a shift, and it'd be interesting to talk about this maybe. For example, last year we had the biggest strike since 1926, which brought together a whole range of different people. We had the March the Alternative last March, which was the biggest workers' demonstration for a generation. So in fact, since I've written my book, there has been a shift. This idea of people mobilising, which was written off, has come back into the public consciousness to a degree, and it certainly has in other parts of Europe. So for me, the only way of changing the situation I'm talking about isn't sort of well-disposed, rambling commentators like myself. It's about people organising from below, organising with those with interests like them, shared interests, which are on a collision course with those at the top. And I think if we do that, we solve the crisis of working class representation in British society, and I think a lot of the issues that I'm talking about today would be resolved. Thank you.